Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another special episode of Voternomics, the Bloomberg podcast where politics and markets collide. I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of economics and government at Bloomberg, and this morning we have another historic election. A few days ago it was in the UK, this time it's in France, and historic in a rather different way. We are in Paris the morning after French voters surprised the world by not granting Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National party the largest number of seats in the French Parliament. Instead, her far-right grouping came third, it looks like, and the new Popular Front on the left came first. So we have investors, financial markets who were priced for a far-right victory, but probably a logjam in Parliament. Instead, we got a far-left victory, but probably a logjam in Parliament. And so far, the way they've digested that result is to have the euro a bit weaker, but if anything, interestingly, a slight strengthening in French bonds relative to Germany. We'll see if that lasts as people start to realize quite how uncertain the future of the government is. And we're going to cut through that fog of uncertainty just a little bit over the next 30, 40 minutes or so here in the atrium of Bloomberg's Paris bureau with some very smart and distinguished guests. From the Bloomberg Brains Trust, starting on my far left, we have Lionel Laurent, known to many of you, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist writing about the future of money and the future of Europe, based here in Paris. And Eleonora Mavroeidi, who is the economist for Bloomberg Economics, part of the economic research group that I run as part of the economics and government coverage at Bloomberg. She's also in Paris and she's worked at pretty much all the big places, OECD, Bank of England, IMF, and World Bank. And joining them, a very special guest who constitutes a brains trust all when he's sitting by himself, Jean-Claude Trichet. Obviously, former European Central Bank president, Bank of France governor, long-standing chair of the Group of 30, the Royal Institute in Brussels, and many other things. We have a very kind audience here at what I was told was a slightly earlier hour for Parisians. So I thank you for coming, and in return, you get to ask some questions, I promise. But I must start with you, Jean-Claude Trichet. One analyst sent me their response to last night's results late last night with just a 3-word subject for the email. What a mess. Is that about right? Or should we be reassured and pleased by this outcome?
I think it would have been a real mess if the Rassemblement National would have had an absolute majority. There, that would have been a total mess. If the new Popular Front would have had an absolute majority, it would also be really a mess. So we are in a situation where things are much better than the messes I was mentioning. That being said, of course, we have a hung parliament, which is a complex hung parliament with 3/3, 1/3 being clearly with a program which is very, very aggressive, I would say, in some respect, in terms of economic analysis. A center in the second position, who is, we know him, and we know what could be done by the center, but he's not in a position of being the first parliamentary force. And then we have the number 3, namely the extreme right. So that being said, if we were in another country, we would say, okay, let's compute, where do we stand? We have an absolute majority, center, plus les Républicains, so I would say Republican right, and plus the Parti Socialiste. It's a governmental party, proved that he was able to govern France and so forth. So why not having this kind of coalition? Of course, we are in France. We are not used to that. We are not in a position to demonstrate to our own people that it would be the right way to proceed. So we will see what happens, but it is obviously complex, even if virtually I see this possible majority.
You have all your years of experience, and then you also have your hope of what happens for France and for Europe over the next few years as a result of this. What do you hope will happen in the next few, and what do you expect to happen?
As a citizen, I hope that after due meditation, discussion, assessment of the various possibilities, this idea that all taken into account, an alliance of political might that has the experience of government in France, namely as I said, the Parti Socialiste and maybe the Greens on the one hand, the Republican right, as I said, and the center could finally have the possibility of governing the country. It's very complex. Programs were signed here and there, and I expect that it would be a long process. But in my opinion, as a French citizen, it would certainly be something which would not be abnormal in comparison with all the other European democracies, and would permit the country to be governed in a responsible fashion.
You were saying to Francine, I think, last week for Bloomberg, that you didn't think the US was France was well suited to a technocratic government in the style of the sort of Monti government or Draghi government in Italy, but that would seem to be at least one possibility coming out of this.
In politics, you should never say never, of course. Nevertheless, it is not at all in the French tradition. So I maintain what I told Francine. I think that it is not likely at all that we could have some kind of technocratic government. In Italy, you not only had Monti and Draghi, you also had President of the Republics that were coming from the central bank, and you had the succession of Prime Minister and then President of the Republic. I mean, it's a strong tradition in Italy, taking into account the complexity of the political life in Italy, taking also into account that there is a place in Roma where you have a very, very strong technostructure, which is the central bank. And this is recognized by all political parties, by the people of Italy. So we are not in this position. That's the reason why I don't expect that we could have such a solution. But as I said, never say never.
And in your old jobs, you would have been, particularly at the ECB, you would be wondering about the fiscal financial implications of this uncertainty, and also what it tells us about the direction of French politics and what is going to be possible for President Macron or any future government. I mean, is the underlying message that this is a government that's going to borrow more and do less to get its public finances in control, and less in the way of the business reforms that President Macron was supposed to be forging?
First of all, I expect, of course, that now that we know the result, the idea that we could embark on a program that would aggravate the situation in the fiscal side, that would aggravate the situation in many respects as regards the creditworthiness, if I may, of the country, would appear not being feasible at all. So I expect a maturing process from now on, that we know that we have the results. The programs, and it was the case of the extreme right program, it's also the case of the left program, the new Front Populaire. We have there programs that are not feasible, frankly speaking. And in my opinion, in my expert opinion, I'm speaking like an expert, not as a French citizen there, I don't think at all that it would be in any respect reasonable to embark into new spendings. We have no room for maneuvering. That's my clear diagnosis. So I expect that, being in a position of responsibility, we will see a dramatic realization by I would say, political men and women in question, that it would be a catastrophe for the country to embark on additional massive spending. So
that's the kind of expectation which sounds like a warning.
It's my expectations. it's my hope also, and it's a warning, certainly. But the warning is there. I mean, you don't need any warning. You have a situation, and you have to be responsible in the situation.
Lionel Laurent, will this be taken as a warning, as an excuse for, or a pressure to mature, as Jean-Claude Trichet is hoping, advising?
So I think what makes this a bit complicated is that even though some parties are saying that they won this election, I think it's pretty obvious that this was a vote against Le Pen, a vote against certain scenarios, but it was not for anyone. Nobody has an absolute majority. So I think it's frankly exaggerated to imagine, as you hear some on the far left immediately saying this is a vote for our program. So I think programs are going to have to be fluid. I think there's no way of getting around it. I also think that my hope is that, you know, given the kind of extraordinary cynicism almost of the way some of these coalitions were constructed, whether it is the far left, which was a real ideological rainbow that was frankly almost untenable, and also in the center with this tactical voting in the middle, I am hopeful that there is going to have to be some reckoning on the program that comes out of a future coalition. There are the numbers. There's something approaching, I don't want to jinx it, but something like Starmerism, where you have the center plus the Greens and the Socialists. The numbers are there, even if the spirit may not be. So I think there is scope to imagine extremes being toned down. My concern is that the campaign itself was really not what I would consider to be a good campaign. It was full of, I mean, even setting aside the whole fake news, there was fake history. There was lots of strange calls to, you felt like you were voting for the 1930s or 1940s or 1980s. There was very little discussion about policy. So I think we may get into a situation where the reckoning of the parties and the elites comes a bit quicker than the reckoning for the voters. So it could be quite unstable. And yes, it may not last more than a year when it comes time to put a budget together. But right now, I'm definitely more hopeful than I was a couple of days ago.
Well, that's interesting about where we could be in a year's time, which I want to go to in a minute. But Eleonora, just to say that, paint the scene for us a little bit about how much leeway there would be. I mean, Jean-Claude is suggesting that the reality will become quite clear, that they would be unable to implement certainly seriously expensive policies from here. But what is the situation that France is in, and how much room for maneuver is there on that front?
Well, the situation is that France's public finances are strained. Debt is high, deficit is widened, interest payments are increasing. It's already considered to be under the excessive deficit procedure of the EU.
So violating the borrowing rules of the European Union.
Exactly. So deficit is it's higher than 3%, and debt is increasing. So the previous government, or still current government, this morning, has put together a very ambitious program to try to tackle these problems and decrease the deficit by 2027 and comply partially with the EU rules. This being highly questioned because it's very ambitious, but it was towards the right direction. Now, our view is whichever coalition or type of government comes in power, there is likely little effort to do any fiscal consolidation. So at the best, we'll stay at the current baseline, which already violates the EU rules. Now, in the case of a left-centric government, likely the left will insist on some fiscal spending, but it will have to be much more moderate than the full NFP program. So, for example, what we estimate the NFP program could cost almost 3% of GDP annually, and that would be increase the deficits substantially by bringing it to 6.2% by 2027, far away from the EU rules. So if the spending is down to 0.5% of GDP, still that will keep the deficit wider than 3% and increase the debt to GDP. So overall, although there is little room for any fiscal spending, there is likely that there will be some to keep everybody happy in the coalition.
Bringing this grouping together and the kind of coalition building or the sort of alliance that was forged last week, quite a few of Macron's reforms were already put on hold, including the pension reform. I mean, if you're in the business community wondering about the underlying potential of France, and so it's not one of the most important things is sort of the long-term growth and what that enables. Should that be the concern, that even with a maturing, even without expensive price tags, you won't get difficult reforms either?
What I have to recognize is that during the 7 years of Macron and successive governments, we had quite a good policy as regards the microeconomics, I would say, attractiveness of the country, the new investment and so forth. The diminishing of the unemployment has been quite spectacular. So this part of the policies were, in my opinion, very much on the positive side. The problem was I would say, public spendings, what you just said, the way we were not respecting the rules of Europe, and also the comparison with other countries that were behaving quite properly because they had a crisis after Lehman Brothers. So that makes a mixed picture, if I may. It would be, in my opinion, extremely bad, taking into account the starting point, to have additional new spendings. You could imagine to have some kind of measures that would not be new spendings, but would give certain satisfaction to what I would say qualify Republican responsible left. And you see what I mean there. So it seems to me that it's not totally impossible not to aggravate the situation, which would be in any case very, very bad, because again, there is no room for maneuvering. And I expect that the realization that there is no room for maneuvering will progressively permit all the political parties' leadership to understand that they have no room for maneuvering, whatever their affiliation, if I may, and including when they have signed a program on the left side, which is obviously extraordinarily bold and obviously extraordinarily out of the situation, taking into account, again, the starting point.
Yes. So, Eleonora, do you think in terms of just the cost of the micro slippage and the macro slippage?
Well, I think that if we look at the program, the NFP, there is a lot of suggestion to increase spending on public services, to increase transfers, also revert the pension reform, and partially will be funded by increased taxes. What we see is that, there will be some boosting in GDP in the short term because of increased spending. There's no parts on investment that will have longer term impacts on the potential. Also, a reversal of the pension reform and increasing labor costs could also harm the labor supply. The other potential fear is that they clearly stated they're not willing to comply with the austerity rules of the EU. So to what extent the whole NFP will stand behind this statement will determine how much they will moderate the policies.
The worry would be that a majority of the French people have voted for radical, extreme solutions of one kind or another last night. And if we end up with a quote unquote reassuring combination, which is matured, which has realized there's no room for maneuver on many of these things, the risk is that the French voters draw the conclusion that they have to vote even more emphatically for extreme because they've just ended up with the same thing. The one thing they didn't want was a continuation of what they had, would be the argument. Lionel, what are the risks of that?
They're obviously present. That's true. I think, though, that, it's interesting to me that certain figures are making a comeback. François Hollande, who arguably pushed through some of the reforms that Macron benefited from, has now made a kind of political comeback of sorts and is even speaking out against Mélenchon, telling him to keep quiet for the sake of the left. Now, obviously, the left has changed, and I don't think it would be the same kind of left if François Hollande was to get a position of power. But I think the constraints that we're talking about are real. They will be felt. Maybe this technocratic idea, even if a technocratic government is definitely not on the cards and not a normal French solution, it would be interesting to me if certain positions, if there was a desire to reach out and find certain apolitical figures, maybe former central bank governors, I don't know, present company accepted, but people who do have credibility in certain areas like the economy to ease some of these tensions, because even beyond fiscal spending, there are deep-seated problems in France, productivity, innovation, demographics. I mean, these are real. And if we have no ambition and it's just a government of convenience that says, let's cut here and spend a bit there, we're not going to solve it. So I hope, again, my hope is that at some point the politics does have to take a step back on some areas.
I guess, Jean-Claude, we should just check. Are you available?
No. Not at all.
I noticed that you are almost exactly the same age as Joe Biden, but you think it's...
Well, for you to judge.
Don't you think that there has to be some... I mean, if you would say, and I think that Marine Le Pen would say this, and indeed we should remember she got the same share of the vote as Keir Starmer's Labour Party, people have voted for change. And if you're trying to respond to that and trying to prevent a move to the extremes, whether it's in a year or an extreme government within a year or within 3 years, is the lesson of this that at some level there has to be a shift to the left? I mean, that's partly what Lionel is saying. I mean, what would be a symbolic but significant move that could be made as that sort of olive branch to the voters who actually feel something has to change?
The main problem is that, as we said, the country looks like being divided in 3/3, and 2 of the extreme thirds are totally at odds. So we are not in a situation where you can say the people want changes and we will give them changes, because the changes in question are exactly at the opposite on major points. So we are bound, and it's more or less one of the first time with the Fifth Republic, to find out a way to get from that position. And my hope, as I said, is that if you take the Republican component of the parliament, you have the possibility, the theoretical possibility of having something which would be representative of the people, because it represents something like a little bit more than the absolute majority when you add up the Republicans on the one hand and the Socialist Party, say, to oversimplify, on the other hand. So again, everybody now has to reflect, mature, as I said, make up his mind. Not only, of course, the leadership of the political parties, but the people of France. The people of France, they are not stupid. They proved that they were not stupid. They wanted changes, but not to that extreme that they would have rocked totally the boat. So they might reflect themselves on what is happening. And I also would bet on the common sense and the responsible, I would say, attitude of our own fellow citizens.
Lionel, what do you think of the solution, particularly bringing with the Republicans, who are not necessarily the great winners of last night's election? How do you think that people would respond to that?
I think it's tough. I do wonder, though, what if we had to find a lowest common denominator between all of these parties, what would it be? I mean, I think clearly taxation, right? Taxes are going up. There's going to have to be some kind of concession, right, on the wealth tax, on some of the tax proposals, on reforms. I just can't see the pension reform being rolled back, but already Gabriel Attal, who's proven to be the comeback kid and the real political discovery of this whole saga, because he has effectively broken with Macron, emancipating himself from Macron to build potentially this coalition. And he was the one apparently who said, well, let's suspend this welfare benefit reform as a gesture to the left. So there are gestures to make. I think even with Le Pen, it wasn't even extreme change, right? The whole bet was that there'd be some Melonification, that she would be surrounded by experts and technocrats, and it wouldn't be the extreme. Well, I think now we have to accept that, there's a Meloni scenario on the right and there's a Starmer scenario on the left. And the real fight over the next few days is to see what will it take? How aggressively will sparks fly to carve off the Republican left from Mélenchon? That's the fight.
Do you see individual figures coming out of this, whether it's Gabriel Attal or Raphael Glucksmann? Do you identify future leaders of some kind of coalition in the current spectrum?
You mean the new prime minister?
No, well, in terms of, but also in terms of being a potential rallying point for some kind of, the discussion, the phrase was parliamentary arc, but not just for the bargaining now, but also as a potential candidate in 4 years' time. That's also something that we're looking for.
Well, I will not pronounce on the candidates in 3 years' time or 2 years and a half. I would not embark on any kind of, I would say, speculation on the way it will proceed. But at a time after sufficient maturing, and then the President of the Republic has a role to play because he will consult all political parties without exception, and it would also create the sentiment that things are more fluid than we might have thought. But all that being said, it seems to me that clearly there should be some kind of discussion for, I would say, some kind of ID majority or coalition that would last for a certain period of time between, again, what I call the Republican left, the Republican right, and the center. And you identify very clearly who would be the negotiating parties there. I agree that it's clear that a new program has to be set up. This new program, in my hope, would not comprehend any kind of net additional spending, because I share entirely the views that you expressed on the fact that there is no room for maneuvering, absolutely no room for maneuvering, not only in terms of, I would say, Europe and European rules, but also no room for maneuvering in terms of preserving as much as possible the creditworthiness of the signature. And that is extremely important. That being said, of course, you have measures that can be taken without having a cost. And that might permit the, I would say, left on the one hand and the center right on the other hand to be reasonably satisfied in the circumstances. So it is my hope, but it is also my expectations, because I don't see anything else to permit the country to proceed.
That's a good spot to leave it for some questions from the audience, or indeed any of the Bloomberg people here. Yes, in the back there.
Hello. You mentioned a couple of times measures at no cost that could please the left-wing Republican parties. Could you name a couple of them that you may expect?
No, I'm not drafting the new program. I'm sorry for that. But my neighbors can do that.
Eleonora, can you think of anything?
It's a bit difficult to think of them. Maybe not doing, for example, the unemployment benefits reform. It's in a way not adding benefits.
What is it, just to those who don't follow all of the reforms, what would that be? What is that?
So the current government has agreed to do a new unemployment benefits reform that would start in July, right now, and that will decrease the duration of the unemployment benefits and also tighten the rules for being eligible for unemployment benefits. And the estimate of the government was that this will add 3.6 billion of savings annually. So not doing that would keep the would have no impact, because currently it's not accounted in the baseline, so the IMF baseline or our baseline, but will keep the left happy.
Jacqueline Simmons, who runs our European coverage.
There have been steps forward with respect to incentivizing the finance and business community, which I think is reflected in this room today, just in the way of, again, incentives, and also centering Paris as a sort of financial hub post-Brexit. And I just wondered when any of you thought about what kind of paralyzing impact this might have, or last night's results might have on this community.
Well, in my view, the first question is, what will be the labor cost in the future? What will be the spending in terms of labor costs? Are they going to increase or not? If we embark into more left-wing policies, that's likely to happen. Also, what will happen with the labor force supply in general? What will happen with the rest of the reforms on they incentivize people to get back into the workforce? But also there is a question of how the markets will react to this uncertainty. And for example, with lingering potential fiscal slippage and this political uncertainty, we expect that markets spreads might stay wide at the current levels for a bit longer until things settle down, or in the case that there is a more left-wing spending, then spreads even might widen further by, for example, 50 basis points compared to the current levels. That creates uncertainty. and will make markets to look to be careful in the coming days, in the coming weeks.
Jean-Claude, where do you think the people who are moving to France, who stayed here?
I would say, first of all, let's take also into account the fact that the worst has been avoided in terms of frightening newcomers and or investors, savers of France, Europe, and the entire world. So that's something which we should not forget. Second, I would say that all will depend precisely on this maturing process I was mentioning, which is a multi-party and I would say multi-citizens maturing process. So we will see. Again, I am reasonably optimistic, as you could see, but of course, when you take a decision, you want to take your decision on the basis of facts. And we will see how things are moving from now on. Again, it seems to me that there is some kind of common sense solutions that would normally please all parties concerned and be the best for our fellow citizens, because after all, a democracy must give the maximum amount of satisfaction to the fellow citizens. And it is absolutely clear that programs that are not feasible, in any case, are doing a lot of harm to the fellow citizen. I was myself experiencing that, because when we had the crisis in Europe, have to say that those that had been spenders and spenders and spenders had to tell their fellow citizens, we are very sorry, but now you have to tighten your belts, and that is very, very difficult. That is terrible. So again, being reasonable is something which is very important for our fellow citizens, and I expect again that this very complex maturing process will proceed from now on.
Lionel.
I guess it will obviously not come as easily to a left government than it did to Macron to do things like the Choose France summit, and even to talk about the capital markets union. I think, that does not seem to be part of the current speech. If we think of the kind of extreme case, it's in the 1980s when Mitterrand came to power. There were nationalizations and expropriations. Obviously, we're not talking about that. And I guess we could also think, well, where, if it is just a question of changing city every few years, where do people go? I mean, this is a global phenomenon, a European phenomenon. It's interesting to me that in Italy, you still have all of these tax breaks to attract foreign investors and hedge fund managers, even with a right-wing populist coalition. So, and also, I think even the left bloc talked about being open to defense, fiscal integration at the European level, but with defense as the hook. So there are some, I think, avenues to kind of incite investment, but I think it will obviously not be with the same supply side focus as Macron has been so far.
If you pull back the lens from a global investing standpoint and indeed a geopolitical standpoint, Bloomberg Economics has done important research showing how Europe as a group has fallen behind the US in its economic potential over the last 10 years. There's a nearly 20% gap that's opened up. It's on course to be a 40% gap in the future if there's no improvement in the underlying fundamentals, the kind of things that you would need to do to untap the kind of investment needed, because it's investment that's the gap. Is capital markets union, is potentially joint debt issuance to underpin investments in green technologies, all of these things that we talk about, the digitalization of the economy, encouraging more high-tech successes. In confronting a US government which under whatever president is going to be pushing money into industrial policy and forging a very different, perhaps more interventionist, more mercantilist economic policy. Before this election, we would have said that the big question mark around whether Europe could possibly do that is the Franco-German weakness, is the weakness of that relationship, but also the fact of the two leaders, President Macron and Olaf Scholz, both being extremely weak. I mean, that doesn't change, Jean-Claude. I mean, if you are looking to Europe to have to actually step up and do things over the next few years in response to China and the US, that seems less likely even less likely now than a week ago, or just as unlikely?
It doesn't seem to me unlikely at all, to be frank, because there is a recognition, there is a joint diagnosis on the fact that we cannot stay as we are with the US on the one hand and China on the other hand, on a number of very, very important issues like high tech, like the platforms, the digitalization of our continent, and so forth, and so forth. So I think that this is the underlying diagnosis, which is present, which is recognized more or less by the various countries concerned. Whether or not, with this, the result of this election, the cooperation between Germany, France, and all others will be oversimplified or overcomplicated, we will see again. I'm not necessarily pessimistic, but the fact is that it was not working very well. But we just addressed the question of 81 and the program of 81. I only want to remind all of us, when the left came in power in 81, we had overall outstanding debt as a proportion of GDP of 20% of the GDP. We are at 111% of GDP. We had a deficit of minus 0.1% of the GDP. We are at minus 5.5 or something. So we are in a very difficult different situation, and we have to take account, of course, of that. It seems to me very important. Now, on what you said on the US versus Europe, you are right in terms of absolute GDP and absolute GDP per capita. But part of the difference between the US and us is that the European, for their own, I would say, sake, prefer not to work too much. And this is true in all European countries. I was surprised myself to recheck with Germany. And in Germany, you have a lot of part-time jobs that makes, all taken into account, the number of hours worked quite miserable in comparison with the US. And it's the same, more or less, and certainly the same in the UK too. I mean, we are living in a different universe in this respect. And of course, it makes an enormous difference. But when I look at the best countries in Europe and the productivity per hour worked, the difference is not that big. And also, we have to take into account, of course, that a lot of European countries are catching up, even on the best European, not necessarily on the best European states. So all American states, all taken into account, I think that we should not overdo the difference between the US and Europe, even if there are absolutely clear, I would say, elements and sectors where we are absolutely miserable, and we have to work on not being that miserable in the long run.
All right. Well, a final question from Alan Katz, our bureau chief here.
You mentioned Jean-Claude Trichet, you mentioned 1981. I'd like to go back a little bit further. You also talked about how the president will have to meet with every single political party. There has to be a maturing process. Everything you say reminds me of what the French rejected, which was the Fourth Republic. Before Charles de Gaulle put in the Fifth Republic, we had this constant negotiation with various parties in parliament. It was an unstable situation. In what way is it the same now as it was pre-1958, and in what ways is it different?
First of all, the President of the Republic has powers that the President of the Fourth Republic had not. So that is very clear, in particular in appointing the Prime Minister. It's a decision of the President of the Republic himself, according to the Constitution. We also have to recognize that the Fourth Republic didn't do such a bad job, all taken into account. Of course, the main problem of the Fourth Republic, it was impossible for them to, I would say, face up with the Algerian War. And the Fifth Republic came out of this absolute incapacity of the Fourth Republic to face up with that war. But all taken into account in the economic and financial sphere, and even in the defense sphere, because the nuclear deterrent of France started under the Fourth Republic. So all the rest taken into account, it was not that such a poor political system. So if we won't be closer to the Fourth Republic, in my opinion, because of the institutions of the Fifth Republic, but we would be closer, perhaps, to other European As a matter of fact, there is not a single European country which had the equivalent of the Fifth Republic. And they all have those negotiations to have a coalition with various political sensitivities after the election. And we are more or less pushed in this direction, which, again, I would not consider absurd. And the reference to the Fourth Republic doesn't seem to me sufficient to say, no, let's not do that. Comparison with the other countries in Europe is something which is quite an argument for embarking on such discussions.
As you know, the way people see these things is 2 data points is a trend. We have a Keir Starmer Labour government in the UK. We have the left outperforming all expectation here in France. Is there a possibility that this is the beginning of the end for the rise of the populist right that we hear about, or is it actually just been a dress rehearsal for next time when they'll manage it?
I said never say never in politics. So, no, I would say it is a clear sign that at a certain moment there is a popular reaction, because clearly we are living in a democracy. The votes are secret. The bulletins are put in the envelope by each individual, each, I would say, fellow citizen, totally independently, and nobody knows and can know what he's doing. So it seems to me that the sign that has been given by the French people, the French citizenship, is very, very important. But I will not draw definitive conclusion on the fact that now there is a progressive withdrawal of population. Take into account also that in the left constituency, there are also populist elements in the extreme left. They are also part of the political spectrum.
Lionel?
Well, no, I don't think. I mean, populism is not going to be defeated. They are not part of the furniture. That's just a fact. The US, the UK, I mean, Trump may come back later this year, and in the UK, Nigel Farage has an even bigger pulpit than ever. So I think we shouldn't get too attached to the idea that nothing should change or shouldn't change too much. In purchasing power, inflation, and immigration were the 2 top concerns for voters in this election. And if we don't even try and offer some kind of dream to people who have seen real wages squeezed, who feel their living standards have declined, and where the divide between rural and urban France is still as deep as ever, then we are going to get Le Pen again in a year or 2 years or 3 years. So let's not forget that.
Okay, we have a message of, I think we've cut through some fog. We have some optimism, but also taking some important lessons from this result. And of course, we've still got plenty to watch over the next few weeks, because we don't know what's going to happen. But thank you for all being here for our recording of Voternomics from our Paris bureau. And thank you to our excellent guests, Lionel Laurent, Eleonora Mavroeidi, and of course, Jean-Claude Trichet. Subscribe to Voternomics wherever you listen to podcasts. Everyone in this room, I shall expect to do that. And if there was anything you didn't quite catch, you will also be able to hear it on the Voternomics podcast feed. But from Paris, thank you very much.